Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the A row, the B row, the C row. Sorry, Jay, you're getting the D. But that's okay. Jay was an educator at Multnomah for...
Get an F. This is the F roll.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
Class again.
That's right. It's the remedial one. Definitely. I would like to share lessons learned from legacy transitions, one my own, but many others. But I want to start by talking about this baton. Imagine yourself being handed a baton, and the gun goes off, and you begin the race. And you're in a relay race. I don't know if anybody ever done a relay race? I've done hood to coast a number of times. Slap a bracelet on, that kind of thing. You have a segment. That's the idea. And imagine you're feeling so good as you round out to the end of your segment. The next runner is poised, hand behind them. He or she is ready to receive the baton, but you have a burst of energy. You're feeling good. You're kind of at the prime, and you just decide to keep running, and you pass the runner. Now, everybody that came to watch that runner run is now immediately mad at you. Everybody else is wondering what you're doing. But you run, and you're running, and you pass the next runner. And somewhere along, just before the finish line, you are exhausted because you trained for a relay and it feels like you're running a marathon at this point. And you fall flat down in the dirt and you hold the baton up and you wonder why no one is there to take it. That was the analogy that came to me when I had been senior pastoring at 14 years. I was down in the Bay Area visiting a pastor who was a friend of mine, had done work at Corbin University when I was there, led worship, preached, taught, really admired him, kind of took me under his wing when he was there. My wife's family's church down in the Bay Area. And so I went down and I went out to breakfast with him. Now, he had planted the church and he had been there 45 years already. And I said, so when do you plan on retiring and what does it look like? Now, see, what I knew was that he had several youth pastors that had been promised the baton, because I got to know some of those guys, because I had been there a long time, off and on vacations and such. And he said, well, I just think I want to preach the rest of my life. He goes, I think my vision is to die preaching. And I thought, I don't think that's a good vision. But out of dear respect and love for him, we finished our breakfast, and I went back and I told my wife, I said, I love him dearly, but I don't want to finish like that. Now, the end of the story is he did eventually finish. He had some health issues. He had to finish. What happened was they got a great guy to replace him. He made it 18 months. 18 months. He had the right words. The search team had the right words. But no matter what they had both sides envisioned, it wasn't that guy, right? And he was the unintentional interim. And he left in deep sadness. And now they still don't have a senior pastor. They've gone to a shared elder model because nobody can be like that guy. That guy had planted the church, and he was there nearly his whole life. Now, one of the oft-repeated visions in Scripture is this idea of passing the baton. I'll use that terminology. Moses to Joshua. Moses to Joshua. There's a point where Moses is going to die, and then Joshua takes over, and there's a passing of the leadership there. Joshua had a lot of time under Moses' leadership, and the baton was passed. There was a point when it was said, Moses, my servant, is dead. And there's a point where we're going to be that person, right? We're all going to be gone at some point. One of these days, we're not going to be here. And we're going to leave this earth. And the question is, what do we leave? Moses left it to Joshua. You continue on, Elijah and Elisha, beautiful transition there. You could look at the Gospels, Jesus and the 12 disciples, Paul and Timothy, all that. I just read a report. I don't know that I like Barna anymore, but the Barna reports that come out are always depressing. But it said that the average age of the senior pastor in America is now 60. 60. I don't have any information that contradicts that. But as I do look around, if we have hair, most of us, maybe it's somewhat grayish, right? So man, you're looking good, man. Keep that beard up. It's looking great. You're the young one in the room, you guys. But the average age of the senior pastor is aging, and the question is, who is going to follow? Wayne Cordeiro, he wrote in a book, Doing Church as a Team. Love that book. He said, if you're having trouble locating effective leaders in your church, could it be that you don't really want to find them? That was a challenging quote for me when I picked that up. And I think that there are leaders. Maybe they're not a replacement. Hey, Scotty, you want to join over here? This is the A row. You can sit in the middle of the A people. That's the D group. Thank you very much. So I started thinking about my transition 10 years before it happened. And I had breakfast with that friend. I was contemplating this. I was doing a series called The DNA of Sunrise, and I was just sharing some of the biblical stories that have informed me, that have been so true to my heart. And the first one was this one about passing the baton. And I had bought like 1,000 batons for people, passed them out. And I said, all of us will be gone one day. I mean, you think about faith, we pass the baton, right? We want our children to believe in Christ. We want our grandchildren to believe in Christ. Somewhere along the way, somebody passed the baton of faith to you, right? In 1970, this guy, Doug Bradley, received Christ at a youth crusade. 2 years later, in 72, he led his friend Doug Rowland to Christ. 1979, Doug Rowland led me to Christ. And I've had the privilege of leading many people to Christ. So the idea of a baton is very biblical. In fact, if you think about that, I mean, for me, I like to imagine just feeling the imprint, the fingerprint remains of the disciples, because somewhere faith was passed to all of us. What will it look like beyond us going forward? I'm not a negative person that says that Christianity is going to be destroyed, in our lifetime or anything like that. But I do believe this generation must pass it on. And I believe as pastors, we must pass on the baton of leadership to the next generation. So I'm thinking this through, and I'm standing there and I'm preaching this message. It was 2012 in September, and I said, in 10 years, I don't think I should be your senior pastor. And there was a collective gasp, and I said, I think the reason is that we need to invest in the next generation. And I said, if I was 34 when I became your senior pastor, that means maybe I'm investing my life in 24-year-olds. I think there was another collective gasp in the room, but that's what we should be doing, right? We should be all about preparing ourselves to pass it. And so I made that statement. I said, I don't know exactly what it'll look like. I'd really like to be at the church forever, but I just can't be your senior pastor for too long, because I'd seen too many examples of guys that were there for decades, and then when they left and the way they left, crashed the church. And I loved my church too much for that. A couple of years ago, I was reading in Numbers 8, 24 to 26 says this in the NLT. This is the rule the Levites must follow. They must begin serving in the tabernacle at the age of 25, and they must retire at the age of 50. After retirement, they may assist their fellow Levites by serving as guards at the tabernacle, but they may not officiate in the service. This is how you must assign duties to the Levites. So I thought, that's kind of harsh. You get 25 years, right? I've had way more than 25 years. But just look at that. You start when you're 25, you end with your 50. That was a law. That was a rule there. But I love what it says afterwards. It says, when you're done at 50, you can do this. You can assist the new guy. And you could stand guard at the door. And so I started thinking about that. That's what I want to do. I want to help the new guy. I want to carry his bags. I want to promote him. And I want to stand guard at the door, because I know changes will be coming. And people won't like that. It's just how it is, right? So how, Lord, do I assist the new guy and stand guard at the door? One day, our job will change. In fact, Rich, you lead IPM, we're all interim pastors. It's about the tenure, right? It may not be 18 months or 24 months, but we're all interim pastors. We're all going to pass the baton, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And so I want to share, as I began this journey the last couple years, interviewing CB pastors in the Northwest, and then some lessons learned, and I'll share mine at the end. I ended up talking with a guy named Rick Harple. Now, Rick ended up being one of the IPM guys, if I'm correct, down there in Corvallis, and I sat down with Rick, and Rick was a guy that had pastored in Yakima for a number of years. He'd been there 24 years at his church. And things were going well. He'd grown the church to 800, a big building expansion. In the last couple years, it had gone to 1,100 people. And so he had just seen season and wave and wave. They had planted several churches in the local area. By all purposes, by outward appearance, he was very successful. But he began to ask the question, what's going to happen after me? And he began to realize that he needed to intentionally hand this over to the next generation. And so he made that decision, he made that declaration, and so a couple things began to fall into place like dominoes. They began to tumble. He realized that one of his key jobs was to help some older staff members transition. He knew that there were some people that wouldn't make it in the next, and so he had to help people transition off. He retired some people, and he began the transition. He said they created a succession team. He said, we wanted to be successful in this. And he continued, he did most of the preaching and most of the leading, but they made a goal to go around to all 30 of their small groups and have conversations with all the people, because they knew that people would hear it another way, or they would hear it from maybe somebody else. Come on, Dave. We're talking about old people that need to retire. Does that fit your job?
It fits what's happening in Montebello, so I'm going to see if I can clean anything.
All right. Dave, you did a great job interiming at, what was the name of the church?
Happy Valley Baptist.
Happy Valley, yeah. Handed it off to the new guy. It's just exploded in growth. Isn't it great to know that the church is better after you're gone?
Yes.
It is. Good job. Good job. And so Rick Harpel did that. He began the process, and he and his wife went to all the small groups, and they just shared the story of what God was doing in his heart so that nobody would be confused, all right? Because you know how word gets around about what people think. The last 2 years, he moved into an interim position. He moved out of his big office. He cleared everything out of his big office, and that vacancy allowed the staff to see the change. He knew he needed to finish a few things. He needed to retire the debt. He needed to prepare the body for a few things. And, he let a few staff go, like I said. They thought it would take about 12 to 18 months. In reality, it took 2 months. It's like all of a sudden everything fell into place, but his heart had been prepared in advance. And Rick knew when the Lord opened that door, it was time. Now, they went from a traditional model of senior pastor to what they call a PLT, a pastoral leadership team. They're here now. And it was a preaching pastor, a discipleship pastor, and an executive pastor. I'm not saying that'll work everywhere, but that's what the model they went to lessen this role that he had for so many years in people's eyes. These are some things he said to me. In fact, the first thing he said to me shocked me at the core. He said, everything I've ever done will be undone, redone, or forgotten. I didn't want to hear that, right? Everything I've ever done, everything. Scott, how long have you been at your church? 16 years. You're doing a great job there. I've done a lot of work there. Imagine one day coming back, it's all different, right? That's going to be hard. You're afraid of coming back after AEC. They've made some changes, buddy. They just forgot to tell you. Yeah, already. He said, everything I've ever done will be undone, redone, or forgotten. And that was a humility check for him. As for me, too. It was really a good wake-up call. He said, don't try to manipulate the future, but concentrate on leaving and leading well on the door, out the door. He said, you need to know what to do next. Now, he didn't. And so he admitted this, that it was hard. So he went down and hooked up with IPM, went down to Corvallis, did a bang-up job. It almost took his life, he said. It was tough. I was down there a couple times with him, coaching him. He didn't have a well-defined next step, is what he said. So if you're going to be in an interim, a transition from legacy, have a well-defined next step. He still had some juice left in the tank, and he didn't know what to do at that point. So he went and did interim work down there in Corvallis. And the church is doing great. Joe is the new senior pastor, and there was a gap between Rick leaving and Joe. Fred up in Liberty Bible up in Ellensburg, Washington. I sat down with Fred. Fred was at his church 34 years as senior pastor, 34 years. And he concluded it was time for the congregation to hear another voice. He just realized he was getting a little tired, and they needed a new voice in there. So they spent a full year in the transition process after he decided to begin the process. Now, Fred was on the search team. Out of all the conversations I've ever had, he's the only one that actually was on the search team. He didn't get a vote, though. He didn't get a vote. But he was on the search team, and he helped with that process. His leadership, he said, was very helpful in the process because for 34 years, they'd not had a search team. So nobody knew what to do. Okay, that's part of that process. Now, they brought Stephen in, Brainine in there a year later, And together they did a sermon series where they tag teamed. They talked about change, the best is yet to come. And so they worked together on their messages. And I thought that was very, very encouragement. Again, once that happened, the pieces fell into place within a month. You know, when you're the old guy, and I've been the old guy, you think it'll take a lot longer. It just started falling into place. And so Fred took a month off to ease the transition, and he stayed on staff. There's a different style that he has, that Stephen has, and that's been good, a different voice, that's been good. Fred stayed on 1 day a week as pastor for care and connection. And he preaches whenever Stephen wants him to. He's the old guy that sticks around, that helps the young guy, right? I remember when I was the young guy preaching 50 weeks in a small church. It's a lot. It's just a lot. And having an old guy around to pick up the pieces was really good. And so that's what Fred has been able to do. Some of the transition, learnings, the lessons learned is that don't overstay your voice. I think that's important. Now, I don't know that we're people that even know how to process that, because we only see and hear our voice. And even if we have dreams and visions for the next decade, what would it look like to overstay your voice? And for him as well, be involved in the process, and his choice was to be on the search team, okay? David Andrus and Chris Henkel, New Hope Community, that's it. So Chris Henkel, old college roommate of mine. David been there 30 years at his church, and so this is in Hermiston. And he was a turnaround pastor. And so he had taken a struggling church, grew it up very large. It's a very solid church, very large church there. A big facility, building. I mean, you know, when you think about Hermiston and then you drive up to their church, you see this, basically it's a mega church for that community. And so Chris was on staff. He started as the worship pastor, made his way up to the executive pastor, and eventually Dave looked at him and said, I think you're the next guy. And so they began that process. He and Chris had a great history, 7 years of staff friendships. The handoff lasted a few years, which brought communication and transparency. Now for Dave, he was ready to retire. So he's one of the guys that after transition, he left. He moved away, moved to Spokane. Chris said he's kind of old school, so he just felt he needed to just 100% vacate, which is totally respectable. But he was very supportive of Chris. Chris had to shuffle some staff members around when he got in the job to fit his style of leadership. Lessons learned, Chris said, lavish honor on one another. Make sure you're constantly in public talking well of one another. Overstate it so people don't underhear it. Chris worked overtime to affirm the old guy. Dave worked to affirm the new guy. Spent a lot of time with the new guy to help him get seated and settled. Even though he'd been there 7 years, it's a different seat he was setting in. Make sure, he said, that you spend time, because the time that Dave spent with Chris was incredibly helpful. And then this was the last learning. Chris said, be strategic about your time in the transition. Chris had plenty of runway. He said it wasn't a crash course. And when everything was clear and the dust settled, it was time. Dave moved on to retire. Another church, Bill Nepper, Josh Holland, Mountain View Baptist Centralia. And so great church. I don't know if you know Bill. He had been there 15 years. Now, the way he said it was he had been transitioned. I think he was in Sandpoint, Idaho. And then he came into this church, and it had suffered. It had been a strong church, kind of suffered under some not the best teaching. Some people weren't being fed as well. So Bill came in, and there was a lot of growth and a lot of transition. And if you go there today, you can see buildings added on and things like that. Now, he started as the interim. So this is an interesting situation. He started as the interim. That was his intent. He wasn't thinking of anything else. And because it worked so well, the church asked him to stay. Now, that's a different one. I know at IPM, you're not allowed to, right? It's kind of written in the rules. You can't do this. And so that was just different. I don't know that that's good or bad. It's just what they did. And Bill decided to stay. And so Bill worked that process there. And eventually, he started looking for his successor. Now Josh Holland, Josh is here, grew up at the church. And he started off in 2006 as an intern. And so he was one of a number of guys that Bill brought underneath of him, sent him to school at Western Seminary. He started going to school there. While he wanted to be mentored in leadership while in school, so Bill and a few of the elders kind of just started looking at this kid, started asking the questions, could this be the guy? One thing is true, Bill is very open-handed. And so Bill, we know him well. He's not one to grip and hold on to things. He knew in his age he wanted to hand on. hand things off. Once Josh finished seminary, he wanted to go into full-time ministry. Bill gave him some assignments. There was a church that was struggling. They went and helped with that church. Eventually, they looked at him and said, hey, I think Josh is the heir apparent. Again, an inside guy that they brought in. They began talking to the elders, said, could this be a process? Would this look like what it should be? And Bill was reaching retirement age and was getting tired of the day-to-day leadership. I don't know if anybody ever tired of the day-to-day leadership. Okay, all right. He liked preaching, loved preaching. Bill's a great communicator, but he just got tired of the day-to-day, the Monday to Friday. And so they brought Josh in on the conversation, and it lasted 2 or 3 years. This is a long transition. The dominoes fell slowly but methodically. It was time to take take it to the church. And so all this was going on with the elders and the leaders at that time. Josh was never pushy or grabby, but waited till the right time. Bill's major discipline was supporting Josh fully. And I had lunch with them there, so they're talking together at this, and they're sharing together. But Bill was honest, and he said there were some things Josh did or said that I wouldn't have done it that way, and it was hard to not speak up. That's one of the lessons. He just had to learn to not speak up, because the new guy will do it differently. There were only a few times when he felt he had to go privately to Josh, and he did it that way. He went privately, and but he passed the baton and let go. Now the church today is stronger than before. Bill is still there. He's hanging around. When I went and did a pastoral leadership training for a couple years there, he'd come and set up tables, and he would hang out, and he was as energetic as a teenager, right? But he knew that his time had come. He preaches whenever Josh wants. It's been 4 years. This was, I believe, a year ago, and things have gone better than anyone ever dreamed. The transition, he said, was better than smooth, and the congregation was very involved. Now, the congregation had concerns because, again, you don't read about this. You read about a different way of doing it. Here's some lessons that they talked about. Make a plan and work it. So Bill had to step up with his elders and start a plan. They hadn't seen a lot of this model. They made a plan. They worked it. It was intentional. The old guy doesn't have to leave. He says it's been healthy for the church to have Bill still around and on staff. And then lead with an open hand. I think that would be true of us any day and age, that we should lead with an open hand and let go of things. Bill was quick to say, it's not my church, but the Lord's. Almost the last illustration is D. Duke, Mike Tadera. Many of us know D. If not, I don't know where you've been. But JBC, the church is 50 years old. D's been there on staff 47 years, okay? And just a great man. D was 60. And he wrote a plan. When he told me this, I laughed. I go, of course you did, D. Of course you wrote a plan. And he began praying. Okay, of course you started praying for the Lord to show him the man who would replace him. Now, Mike had been attending JBC as a younger man and had come up to D and said, I need something to do. Had some ministry experience. He and his wife moved there. He had pastored at Deaver Connor, and there were some struggles there, and it kind of crashed and burned, so he showed up at JBC. And he finally went to D and said, I need something to do. And D gave him the college-age ministry. And D watched and prayed. And he saw that Mike was doing really well and that Mike was able to grow and add stability here. So in 2011, he gave him the missions ministry. And in 2011, D went on a 48-state trip. I remember this. He went on a 48-state motorcycle trip. And he wrote a letter to the elders. And he said, if I don't make it, if I die on this trip, okay, I want you to make Mike the senior pastor. He'd already been having conversations with them in closed doors. Just, I think he would be my replacement. They weren't ready to go to the congregation. In 2013, D came back from a bicycle trip, which was probably at least 48 states, if not across the U.S. and back, and he asked Mike to do 2/3 of the preaching. Now, this is a situation, and this is different than any of them, where the congregation didn't vote on this change. All the rest of them, including mine, the congregation voted on the change. But in their bylaws and structure, the congregation didn't vote. But all of a sudden, as Mike began to do 2/3 of the preaching, people got used to him, and they began to like him. And Dee began to feel more and more comfortable with the decision. This is the longest transition out of all of them. It took over 10 years, maybe 12, depending on some of the conversations. In 2020, Mike began leading the staff meetings. In 2022, he began leading the elder meetings. Dee wrote a new job description for himself, limiting his role. A couple years ago, I asked Dee, I said, what's your job description? He goes, well, I get paid and I get to go fishing in Alaska and ride my bike all summer. I go, anything else? He goes, whatever I want. I'm like, I want that job description, Dee, thank you. Can you send that to me? Great. But the reality is this, is that he intentionally cut off his influence. At times, Dee said, I've been a little slow. This is recording, but he did say this. It's not in my notes. He said, he said, James, it's like having someone else sleep with your wife. Okay. That's kind of interesting. I laughed. I go, I don't think I would use that analogy. But he goes, I've pastored this church. I've built this church up. And it's hard to let someone else be in charge. Let's just be honest. For all of us, right? It's hard sometimes to let go. So Dee's been a little slow at times. Mike's been a little fast, but they worked it out. Dee said sometimes it's hard to see things done differently. I'll tell you that. Man, sometimes it's hard to see things differently. But he had to remind himself that the bride of Christ was healthy. And if the bride of Christ is healthy, that's really the goal. Dee didn't want the church to fragment. He had heard horror stories of a long-tenured pastor leaving and everything crashing afterwards. He did not want that to happen. He had read those horror stories. Some lessons learned. Dee said, lead to the end. Dee didn't want to invest his whole life in this church and then see it fall apart because of his bad leadership in the transition. He said, he said this to Mike. This is kind of funny. Mike told me this. Dee said to Mike, I have authority. You don't. You didn't earn it. Go get it. And Mike realized that's true. A business card, a title doesn't give you the authority. It's with the people. And so Mike worked for years to get the authority. Mike says it was 15 years. Dee thinks it was a little less than that, but that's okay. He had to learn his lessons. Mike said one of the hardest things was Dee took a small church, and he learned his hard lessons when there were very few people. He said it's a large church. I don't know what they are, 1,000 plus people, but the fact is that Mike said the hardest thing to do was to make my mistakes in public. But Dee was gracious, and the people were loving. Mike said that really only a handful of people left. I confirmed this with Dee. Maybe 6 families left. Other than that, things were fine. Dee still preaches on Wednesday nights to pacify his fans and followers, you know. But Mike is solidly the lead pastor. Mike is, making it work. I stopped there. I was going to Sunrise Men's Retreat. I stopped for a men's breakfast, and I talked to a couple guys, and I asked about where's Dee, and guys didn't know who Dee was. Yeah. Isn't that great? They knew who Mike was. I found Dee. I found Mike. Had breakfast. This was one of the lessons. He says, love before you lead. Mike had to get to know the people before he preached to them. So he had to go love them for a season before he would have the ability to preach to them. And then this is another often repeated one, lead with an open hand. Dee was very open-handed, and Mike was very teachable. And then be yourself. Mike was intimidated. Who wouldn't be if you know Dee? He was intimidated by Dee. Dee has a lot of success marks, as it were. But Mike, as a young guy, needed to realize that the Lord was going to do good things through him as well. So don't be intimidated, but it was hard. So those are some of the things there in that one. Love to just dialogue a little bit on those, and then I want to share some of the things that I learned along the way on my journey. Let's talk about that. What are some of the things you're hearing here? Any similarities, differences, variations?
I would say a couple of things. One is he was very intentional. The ones who worked, those that were very intentional in having a plan to see it work.
Yeah, those that worked were very intentional, and they had a plan. The plan varied, but there was something.
But the biggest that I saw is the established pastor had to be willing to let it go.
Yeah, the established pastor had to be willing to let it go. Excellent. And let's be honest, that's hard for all of us. I testify, that's hard. When I heard Rick's words, everything that we've ever done is going to be undone, redone, and forgotten, man, I choked because I've worked hard. I mean, that's just hard, right? It's hard on your ego, right? Yeah. Bob?
I asked Mark Hafner earlier today this kind of a similar question in terms of my own thinking ahead. I'm looking at 60, and I learned in missions it's better to go when they want you to stay than to stay when they want you to go. And so, but how to know? How do I know when that time is? And one of the things Mark said was actually, he said a lot of that is with you when you're ready to let go. Are you really ready to let go of this or that or that? And have you prepared somebody else for it? So, but that idea of, am I really ready to let go of that? And to let it be redone, undone, forgotten. That, those were words that helped me.
I was talking with my wife. We just got back from a walk on the promenade there, and appreciating just the words of Jonathan. And the reality is, we've all had hard times. His way exceed mine, but there's a lot of learnings along the way. But one of the things, you have to have a lot of self-awareness. A lot of emotional intelligence to be able to say, I think it's time to close this down. To let other people speak in your life. And I would say, as senior pastors, lead pastors, when we plug along year after year and we have more wins than losses and things keep going up and to the right, it's hard to look in the mirror and see maybe you should not be that guy anymore. Because all the indicators are saying things are fine. But when are you ready to go? You need a team of people around you to maybe indicate.
Yeah, I'm more afraid of, in the sense of, not fear, but I'd be more concerned about staying too long than of leaving a little early and in that case missing something.
Yeah.
But the words of ready the transition, prepare the next, and then be ready to let go. Yeah,
and Mark's on that journey too. Yeah. One of these days, I think he tells me a lot in 2 years. He keeps moving, but he's moving to halfway. He's got a place there, and he'll pass the baton at White Salmon. He's done an incredible job there, but one day it won't look like that anymore. When is it time to leave? Yeah, that's a tough one. What are the things you're hearing? What are some of the similarities, the differences, the questions?
Just noticing that, a lot of the up-and-comers they're on track, but they haven't arrived.
Yeah. Yeah.
To give them space to make mistakes.
Yeah, let the young runners run. They've got a lot more energy. They need opportunity. You need to let them preach. That is a hard thing when you're doing a good job, let's say. You're doing a good job at it, and the young guy isn't where you're at. Of course he's not where you're at. He's not going to be where you're at. You weren't where you're at. But to let him up there and affirm him in public, I've had people up speaking for me that were not even close to where I was at. That's okay, because I think the body, when they love people, they'll overlook that, right? They'll overlook that. But you have to give them opportunities to take those steps. Otherwise, those young guys will run off. In the situation that I started with, my wife's former church grew up with, there were 2 or 3 youth pastors that were teased the baton and were great in the pulpit and great in leadership. But when the time came, the baton got yanked back. They went off to somewhere else, which is fine in the big kingdom scheme of things. But there's still a hurt in many of their eyes because they could have done it. They really could have done it and done it well. And now the church is struggling. I was there at Christmas time and a couple weeks ago. It's just struggling without a leader. What else? So how many of you, but just by raising of hands, would think that you need to be thinking about this in the next 3 to 5 years? Anybody? Okay. All right. So this is an important topic. So what are your questions? I'll wrap up with my story in a bit. But what are your questions? Jim, what are you thinking?
Came in a little late when you're talking about Rick Hartwell, but just being honest, they had guys in the wing. And sometimes in a smaller church, you may not.
Yeah.
Especially like where I'm at, Belfair. Those young guys grew up and they leave.
Yeah.
And they don't want to stay.
Yeah.
It becomes really hard.
So you've been at Belfair how many years?
24.
24 years, okay. And you've had some rough goes. You've had some big challenges that you've worked through and done a wonderful job with that. Not that any of them have been fun. You wouldn't have ever wished them on your worst enemy, right? But you've endured through those and you've learned some things. How big is Belfair as a community? I know there's people that commute from Seattle and whatever, but...
Man, you look up on the census, 500.
500.
in Belfield.
Yeah.
And then there's outlying areas.
Yeah. Yeah. So you may not have the same opportunity
Right.
that a person like any maybe some of these guys, right?
So the idea is hopefully find a youth pastor.
Okay.
And
That's good.
that's part of the plan. I would mention some of that too.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
bring in a youth pastor and keep an eye on him for a few years and see how that's going.
Mm-hmm.
And ask the Lord, give us a guy there.
Yeah.
I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned several large churches, so
Mhm.
they have a big pool.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm not complaining.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. What if you don't have that guy in your church right now? Mhm.
Makes that transition very difficult. A
Absolutely.
lot of small churches are in that position.
They are, and more so coming up. There are not a lot of replacement guys in the wings.
Which is the other,
Yeah.
serious problem.
Other guys that are thinking, along the journey. I mean, what are some of your thoughts or questions that you're wrestling with right now?
Part of my thoughts, just like you said, just the talent pool or the available guys. So in our journey, about 10, 11 years ago, called a young youth pastor, watched him grow up, watched him mature in ministry, and I was convinced, and I think the congregation was convinced, he's the next guy.
Mm.
I wasn't ready to step down.
Okay.
And church from Northern Washington stole him away, paid him a lot more money than I could pay him. So starting over again.
Yeah.
And as we were looking for that student ministry guy to replace him, in my mind is that he's the next pastor. But that talent pool was pretty thin. And we didn't find the next pastor quality candidate. Found a great student ministry pastor. But at this point, I don't see him ready to step in as I'm ready to step out.
Okay. So again, it's about the replacement, finding the right guy to come in. And maybe you had one, but it was too early in the game. You weren't done with your leg of the relay.
I wasn't ready to give up my salary is what it was. So.
This is being recorded. That's an honest moment from Glenn Small. There we go. No, seriously, that is hard, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to think that through. How old are you now?
64.
64. Okay. All right. You still have years, though. There's a lot of opportunities. But what about the church? Yeah. Anybody else?
That last statement you made about that he said, I have the authority, you don't, I
Yeah.
think you need to go get it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's just an interesting thought. So Scott sitting next to me here has a lot of skills.
Yeah.
Ministry skills.
Absolutely.
Ministry character. So the question is, what does earning that look like, and how in the next 2 years, we're thinking of transition, I can either pass on that, and I don't know if I can. Again, that whole quote is he's got to earn it. How does that happen? Again, after 35 years, there's a process, a long track record that I've been able to earn that. So it's just a big question.
So you've been there 35 years? Yeah. That's a little longer than I thought. Wow. That's amazing. Thank you. But he's not going to learn it in 2 years. You can't in 2 years gain what 35 years has, but you shouldn't be expected to. But something should happen. There should be an obvious, intentional, space given so that, Scott, you are freed up to earn some of that authority and relationship. And that's the intentionality question. And you'd have to ask if you're still going to stay there afterwards, or if you guys are going to move to Phoenix or something like that, And so there's maybe a little more runway depending on how you slice it. Because if you eject, and that's fine. If you do, then it's on him in 2 years. But if you decide to back up and strategically phase in something, that's a little easier on you, on Scott, on the congregation. Yeah. Good. Questions, thoughts?
I had a story by Paul Tripp.
Yeah.
I think he was a young pastor somewhere. I don't know if the details are perfect, but he was really ready to move on. And he's applied for a church in California or something. And one older man in his church just came alongside of him and said, where do you think seasoned, godly pastors come from? They start when you're young. every single one had to start where you are. I feel like that coming alongside of a young man is really, really important.
Mhm.
To encourage them.
Which we should be doing anyway.
Right.
That's disciple making.
Right.
Not to guarantee that they're going to replace us, but we should be doing that anyway. We should be coming alongside of people. Yeah. So just to pick up where I was at, I was 4 years as youth pastor, 14 years senior pastor. We had already grown. We were probably 1,500. We'd started at 158. We were in the throes of planting. We'd had a Hispanic church, ex-prisoner church, planting a church in Forest Grove. And we were just on the cusp of doing that. And that's when I made my declaration. And so nothing really happened for a couple years. It just took time. But I brought this, I looked back at my sermons every few years, I brought this statement out again, brought my baton out again and say, hey, don't forget, we're supposed to be making disciples, which includes me, which includes transition. Don't forget, I said at some point. In the fall of 21, there's a lot more story there if you care, but in the fall of 21, I officially pushed the button and I made the statement, it's time to start a search team. And we hadn't done it in 23 years at that point. And so it was about a 6-month process, and God brought a young man, Paul, as my replacement, and I stepped down to part-time, 2 days a week. I know in our bylaws that the senior pastor does all the hiring and firing, and so I said, here's all I ask. I said it a couple times. I said, just be honest, it's a flesh thing. Just hear my heart, it's a fleshly thing. I'd like to make it to 30 years. It's total flesh thing. If I don't make it, that's fine. But if I could make it to 30 years, I'd feel good. And so June 30th, I preached my last sermon, and I'm done. I'm no longer on staff. I've preached every 5 or 6 weeks for him, and I enjoy it. I love it. I no longer, the first year I went to staff meetings, I looked at him and said, you don't need me? You don't want me at staff meetings? He goes, yeah, I'd love. I go, you don't. Trust me, because people still look to me. And they shouldn't be looking to me in the room. They should be looking to you. And so I ejected out of that, stopped doing that. I don't know much of what's going on, which is hilarious, because I say this in the right way. I don't care. I don't mean that in a callous way. I remember walking in one morning, I was printing some documents out. I had to go to the CV office. And I walked in, and the HR gal, Jody Ann, was there. And she said, oh, did you see the fire trucks? I go, no. She goes, oh, there were fire trucks here. And I didn't even ask the question why. And then our worship pastor goes, oh, did you see the fire trucks? I go, no. And so I said, why? He goes, well, one of the HVAC units short-circuited, and there was a smoke alarm that went off. And he says, we might have to buy a new new HVAC unit. Now, in my heart, I knew I had left just over $1 million in the bank, total of everything. And I walked out of there smiling, and I thought to myself, with all love, not my circus, not my monkeys, you know? With all love, though, with all love. And I, it was, I'm wearing this sweatshirt for a reason, because it was hilarious, because Paul, our new senior pastor, said, hey, will you preach the vision message? We did it a year ago. Would you preach the vision sermon with me? I said, yeah, you tell me what you want me to preach. And so he gave me the sermon and said, fill in the blanks here, add some old man stories, which I'm like, totally, that's fine. I can tell old man stories. And it went together. But the night before, this is great. He said, hey, we're going to be wearing hoodies with our new logo and vision statement. And I had no idea. I didn't know we had a new logo. I didn't know we had a new vision statement. And I showed it to my wife, and I laughed, and I said, the beautiful thing is I'm going to enjoy this, because I don't care. In the sense that I had done all that too. When we had a town hall, after I pushed the button, metaphorically speaking, and said this, one of the ladies said, James, what if the new guy comes in and changes things? And I said, he will, because I did. And so I said, well, what are the colors? And he shared the colors, and I said tan, and I went and tried it on. I go, that's not my color. So I grabbed black. And so I sat there, and I wore this, and I love it. New things, new colors, new everything. And that's fine, because I did all that. And when you let go, it's a beautiful thing. I had one of the guys who had actually been on the search team met me at the door when the process was wrapping up. He goes, James, I know you're going to have a hard time letting go. And he went on, and I said, I'm not. He goes, yes, you are. And I go, I'm not. So when I preached the sermon, we actually were preaching through the whole Bible in a year, doing a chronological version of the Bible, preaching those messages. We preached Elijah and Elisha, and I passed the baton. And I had a special one of these made, engraved with his name on it. And when I passed it to him, I truly passed all of the responsibility, and I felt the weight off my shoulders. Now we have 2 services, so I had to do it again. But I walked away thinking, thank you, Lord. I've had a great run at this church. And what was my responsibility is no longer my responsibility. Some of the things that I learned along the way, and one of them was just something I didn't really know. A friend of mine began the transition process after 20 plus years at his church. And he ascribed to what I'll call conventional wisdom, which was you need to leave, eject, they'll get an interim, they'll forget about you, and a new guy will come. And he traumatized the church. Half the church left. It was about a 450 person church, was down to just over 200. People were hurt, people were wounded. Several of the elders reached out to me. I went and did meetings, and they said, how could our pastor ghost us? He was our shepherd. So I knew not to do that. And I would say, if anything, don't do that. That's conventional wisdom. I think it's wrong. If you've been leading and loving that long, love. I lead all the way through. In June of 22, we preached our message on Elijah, Elisha, and I passed the baton. But I was the leader until I wasn't anymore, because I had been called by God to be the leader, and I was the leader before, and I was the leader during, and in that moment, I was no longer the leader. And that was okay. But I wasn't going to abdicate my leadership until then. Grieving. Oh, this is good. Rick Harpel said this. Rick, he said they had a small group of elders and other people surround he and his wife and check in monthly on how they're doing. I had some friends that did that for me because I had no idea of the grieving. There were moments. It's like I've never lost a close loved one yet. I'm not allowed to go to grief share at our church yet because I haven't experienced that. But if you've ever lost a loved one, you know, grief is the strangest thing. It just comes upon you like a wave and it smacks you and knocks you down. And then it seems to be gone for a while. I experienced that. Grieving is real. You can't expect just to move on quickly. And I just moments, not bad, just grieving. Standing there looking at things, weeping, going, thank you, Lord, for the season of doing this. It's not my season anymore. It's a beautiful loss. Support the new guy, no matter what. He's a new pastor. I told people a couple times in public, don't complain about the new guy, because I won't hear you. I had 2 ladies complain, and I said, you can't be doing that. I already told you not to do that. And whether you like it or not, it's irrelevant. Whether I like it or not, it's irrelevant. He's our pastor. He's my pastor. He's my pastor. Let's support him. So I do whatever he wants me to do, which is typically preach every 5 weeks or so. I'm doing a class for seniors right now. And come June 30th, I'll preach my last official sermon. And I get a sabbatical. And I'll be hanging out with my wife at other churches this summer, just a distance, for sabbatical's sake. And then in September, we start a small group with a bunch of old people we know and love, and we've walked for 20 years. And we'll be small group leaders, and we'll lead in our home, and we'll do that. And if he ever asks me to preach, I'll say, I don't think I have time for that. Because I'm going to be preaching a lot more for CV churches. I'll fill in the gap for Paul. I think that'd be fine. But guess what? Every Sunday I'm there, I'll be standing at the door greeting people. Because that's what I do, right? I'm not their pastor anymore, but I'm still there at the church. And one day, I won't be, because I'll be dead. And one day, we won't be, because we'll be dead. But we want the church to be stronger. Any last-minute thoughts, last-minute questions? Yes, sir.
I'm obviously the young guy in the room, and I love this topic because I think we should, from the very beginning, be thinking about ourselves as leaders. And I would love to hear a word about, if you were to rewind the tape 25 years or however many, 30, is there a way, would you have started out differently? Would you have conducted yourself differently with the end in mind?
Well, I'll tell you what I would consider my biggest mistake. How about that? Because when I started at Sunrise, I didn't know what I knew or didn't know. I had no idea. I'd been a youth pastor 9 years. That's all I knew, right? I was going to youth pastor old people. I figured it all out along the way, you know. And I thank God for people, mostly through books and whatever, and then some CB pastors that coached me for a while. But I'm an optimist. And sometimes that's not a good thing. And what I mean by that is it's kept me going for years through some hard seasons. But it also has blinded me to some obvious realities about myself or about others. And Jay can share some stories. He was with us for close to 2 years there, and as executive pastor. And I had a young guy that I was firmly convinced would be my replacement. And when a couple people came to me and said, I don't think that should be it, dear people, I didn't want to hear that, so I didn't hear that. And that was wrong. A guy in my church, Paul, he works at the Union Gospel Mission. He said, hey, I want you to meet a guy. And so we had coffee. And the guy said, hey, I work with Western Seminary, and I do this training called IDAC, and, you know, and I listened to it. He goes, I think it'd be great for your churches and everything and pastors. And I said, reduce it down. What is it? He goes, well, if anybody wants to make a move in the organization, this will give them a well-rounded test. I go, oh, that sounds exactly like a guy that I've got. And so he took the IDAC test, and I sat down, and this is the gentleman. He told me, he said, what are you looking at for this guy? He said, to take my place. And he said, no. And he told me why. So I went to 2 other people on staff, an admin pastor, my exec pastor at the time. And I said, I don't know how to interpret this. And I didn't want to hear it. I really didn't want to hear it because my optimism was way too high. And so I assigned duties, and along the way, invested deeply in this guy. And he was not the guy. And I'm very responsible for that because I should have listened to people outside of that circle, and I should have yielded to that even when I didn't want to, but I was blind to that. And my optimism is I believe God can do anything through anybody because I look at me. I was just a youth pastor. If I list all the things that God did at our church, it's crazy. I don't deserve any of that. I wasn't smart enough for any of that stuff, but God did it. So I just optimistically, blindly think God can do that for everybody. And I know that's not the case. I don't know why. I don't understand how that works in the sovereignty of God, but I have that kind of hope for everybody. That did not go well in this situation. It did not go well at all. And I'm responsible.
Do you mean that because you strung them along a little bit?
I didn't string him along using that metaphor, but I led him where I shouldn't have led him. And I didn't listen to voices that said otherwise. And that's my responsibility.
There's another piece along the way that, from something you said earlier about how you didn't care about what was going on. You didn't need to know everything about what was going on, but you prepared yourself to be able to transition out that way. Because when I sat in your leaders cohort a few years ago, you were telling us, if you're going to be the lead pastor, you don't need to know everything that's going on. That people would, and you had some people leave because they said, well, I can't be in a church that the lead pastor doesn't know about everything that's going on.
Right.
But if you know about everything that's going on, you're not releasing and enabling others. That was one of the points you made. So you had taught yourself to do that along the way, even before transition. I think that's helpful for us.
That's true, Bob, but there's also the reality that, like preaching, you don't just treat it that way, right? There are certain things you do that are intrinsically tied to your job. And maybe identity, you know, that was another conversation my wife and I had. I don't think I ever knowingly wrapped my identity with my job. And so my identity is not wrapped up in my church. I think so much has changed. In fact, I tell young guys, don't make any changes in the first year. Just spend the whole first year loving them, and then you'll have the right to lead them. I can't tell you the number of times I've told young guys that. My guy, he's changed everything in a year and a half. Okay, so what? I don't care. in the sense that not I'm ambivalent to it in that, it's just that it's not my church, and it never was. But I have to get used to accepting that, because it's okay. Who cares about those things? If the kingdom of God is being established and people are coming to Christ, people are being baptized, ministries are going on, that's a beautiful thing. It just doesn't have my fingerprint on it anymore, and I have to let go of that.
But my point is that would have been harder, all the harder for you to be able to do that if you hadn't already developed
Very true.
practice in not having your fingerprints on everything.
Yeah, because that was one of the things in that cohort I talked about, was that if you're going to go from a small church to a medium-sized church, culturally, you have to not know everything, you have to not show up at everything, you have to not do everything, and people are going to have a hard time with that because they expect the pastor to be at everything, to know everything, to do everything. And if you are doing all that, that might tell us a little bit more about your identity issue than about your leadership as far as the pastor. And but I think that was important too. And maybe that's true, Bob. I appreciate that. Last minute thoughts? We'll wrap it up.
James, there's two resources I would
Yeah.
suggest. David McKenna wrote a book called The Leader's Legacy.
The Leader's
McKenna was
Legacy.
a seminary president years ago. Probably a used book now, but The Leader's Legacy, a really good book that helped me. Secondly, Roy Oswald from Alban Institute wrote a little pamphlet called Running Through the Thistles. It's about pastors when they are coming to the end of their ministry and leaving their church. Some good advice in both of those resources.
Okay, Running Through the Thistles.
Running Through the Thistles by Roy Oswald.
Roy Oswald.
It's a pamphlet, kind of
Okay,
a thick little
sure.
pamphlet.
And the other book?
The Leader's Legacy
The Leader's Legacy.
by David McKenna.
David McKenna. Okay, that's on this recording. Okay, good. And Rich has experience in this because you take guys that have, throughout their seasons, built things, and now you reposition them for a different season of ministry. Yeah, kind of the last leg.
In my own ministry, I hired a guy, and I said, I can give you 3 years before I'm going to probably go into higher education. I want to get you ready for your next church, whether it's this one or the next one. Long story, but he ended up being there 14 more years after I left.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Well, good.
But you have to know when to go looking for them. I went in May when everybody was picked over like a Kmart salesman. So I waited 6 months and then went back in January when the seniors were still looking for what they were going to do in the summer.
Yeah. Just think about this. Maybe you should go, I think this, I bought this on Amazon, I don't know. Just go buy a baton and sit it on your desk. Just set it on your desk. Here, Glenn, that's yours. And just keep it there. And if anybody asks, just ignore the question, but contemplate it. Because one day you will pass the baton, right? That's what Paul said to Timothy, and that's what we should be doing. So let me pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I know it's a hard conversation because we don't know what's going to happen next for us. It may be about finances. It may be about our future. It may be about retirement. It may be about our identity being wrapped up in it. Those are all very real things. And we just really need to be looking at the next generation anyway, pouring into them. Give us wisdom to see, like some of these lessons learned as other pastors have walked the journey. It'll look different for each one of us, but may it look like Christ along the way, who passed off to the 12, who passed off to where now, 2,000 years nearly later, we have it. May our legacy last because of Christ, not because of our name. We pray in your name. Amen. Thank you, guys.